They found a Sumerian word carved where it should not exist, older than the gods themselves. The tablet doesn't invoke the Anunnaki. It predates them as if something was already here, already naming reality before the gods arrived. If the Anunnaki weren't first, then who were they answering to? Close your eyes. Let 6,000 years fall away like ash from a broken seal. Then 7,000. Then 8. You are standing now at Uruk in the archive chamber, where the first scribes learned to press meaning into clay. In your hands a tablet no larger than your palm, but it does not describe a god. It describes a condition. A single word carved when writing itself was still an experiment. Dingia. Not a deity, not a being. A word for divinity itself. Holiness without a face, power without a story, sacredness that existed before anyone thought to explain where it came from. This is not the story of how the Anunnaki created civilization. This is the story of what existed before the Anunnaki were ever named, before gods ruled cities, before temples had dedications, before divine genealogies explained where authority came from. The oldest Sumerian records do not describe a beginning. They describe words that outlasted the meanings they once carried. And beneath those words, a world the Sumerians themselves remembered as already ancient when writing began. Before we descend further into these unmarked silences, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you're drawn to the kind of history that sleeps beneath temple foundations and flood layers. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. The visuals are here to guide you, though the story unfolds just as clearly in darkness. Your support means everything. The story begins not with creation, but with a word that had no owner. In the earliest layers of Sumerian cuneiform, etched into clay at Uruk and Eridu, when writing was barely distinguishable from accounting. This term appears again and again. Archaeologists examining these tablets note something strange. Ding does not function as a name. It functions as a marker, a sign pressed before mountains, stars, temples, and principles to indicate significance, divinity as a quality, not a being. The oldest texts do not say Enki is Ding or Enli. They say this mountain is Dingier, this ritual is Dingia, this boundary is Dingia. The word marks what matters, what holds power, what stands apart from the ordinary world. But it does not say who or what made it so. And this is where the first fracture appears in everything we assume about ancient myth. Because when the Anunnaki finally enter the written record, they do not arrive as creators. They arrive in administrative texts, ration lists, temple inventories, records of offerings distributed to divine officials. Their names are written with the Dingia sign placed before them, as if to say this being now carries the quality that already existed. The word came first. The god came later. Scholars examining Sumerian temple archives at Nippur and have traced this pattern across centuries of inscriptions. Sacred sites existed before the gods who would claim them. Rituals were performed before myths explained their origins. The Dingia sign appears in texts that predate the mythological genealogies by generations, sometimes centuries. The gods did not establish holiness. They inherited it. And this pattern extends beyond language into the ground itself. At Eridu, the city the Sumerians themselves called the first. Archaeologists have uncovered shrine after shrine, each built directly atop the ruins of the one before. The sequence stretches back into the 6th millennium BC, long before the Sumerian king list claims kingship descended from heaven. The shrines are identical in orientation, identical in function, rebuilt generation after generation in exactly the same location. But no inscriptions name a deity. No dedications explain who the offering served. Sacred space without divine identity. Worship without a god to worship. The same silence appears at Uruk. The great temple complexes rise from earlier structures, layer upon layer of human labor extending thousands of years before the myths describe divine intervention. The White Temple sits at top older platforms. The Ayana precinct grows from simpler shrines beneath. The cities were already there. The gods arrived later to name what humans had already marked as sacred. Then comes the second word, quieter, but no less profound. The Mi were not gods. They were principles: kingship, law, music, snorts, craftsmanship, ritual order. In later myths, the gods distribute the Mi like possessions. Enki holds them. Inanna steals them. Divine beings negotiate their transfer as if they were objects to be owned. But the archaeological record tells a different story. These institutions, kingship, law, irrigation, writing, operated before the myths describing their divine assignment were written. The Mi existed as functional systems before they became mythological objects. The word for order came before the story explaining its origin. And that raises the question the Sumerians themselves could not answer. If the gods did not create these systems, who did? The myths avoid saying, void. They avoid describing a beginning. They avoid naming a first cause. Instead, they begin with a single phrase that appears in text after text, hymn after hymn, chronicle after chronicle, after kingship descended from heaven. Not created, not invented, descended as if authority itself, the entire apparatus of rule, hierarchy, and governance arrived fully formed into a world already prepared to receive it. As if power came from elsewhere, from something the texts themselves cannot or will not name. And beneath that silence, another silence deeper and older, still between the earliest occupation layers at Eridu and the first written mentions of the gods. There is a gap, not a gap in habitation. Cities continued. Shrines were rebuilt. Agriculture flourished. A gap in memory. The Sumerians inherited functioning systems they could not explain. They possessed words whose original meanings had already faded. They rebuilt temples whose founders they could not name. So they did what any civilization does when memory fails. They turned abstraction into personality. They gave the word ding a face. They made the Mi into divine possessions. They invented gods to carry meanings that had outlived their explanations. The Anunnaki were not the beginning. They were the answer to a question no one could remember asking. And the proof lies not in what the texts say, but in what they preserve without explaining. Words older than the gods themselves, marking a world the Sumerians knew had existed, but could no longer fully recall. Tonight we follow those words backward past the myths, past the flood layers, past the moment when writing began to ask the question the oldest Sumerian records leave unanswered. If the word for divinity existed before the gods, what exactly were the Sumerians naming? The oldest cuneiform tablets do not begin with stories. They begin with lists. Grain distributed to workers. Silver weighed for trade. Animals counted in temple storerooms and pressed beside certain entries. Mountains, stars, sanctuaries. A single sign appears with no explanation. A star enclosed in a box. Later scholars would call it the Dingia sign. But in those earliest inscriptions, it has no mythological context. It simply marks. What it marks is harder to define. In texts from Uruk dating to the late 4th millennium BC, the Dingia sign appears beside the word for sky, not as a name but as a classifier. The sky is dingier. A mountain peak is dingier. A boundary stone separating irrigated land from desert is dingier. The sign does not describe action. It does not imply will. It marks a condition, something set apart, something potent, something that structures the world around it. This is not the language of theology. This is the language of taxonomy. Linguists analyzing these early tablets note that ding functions as what later grammarians would call a determinative, a sign that clarifies category, not meaning. It tells the reader this word belongs to the realm of significance. But it does not say why. It does not name who decided. It simply is. And for centuries, that is all it does. The sign appears in administrative records, in boundary markers, in ritual object inventories, always as a marker, never as a subject. The scribes who pressed it into clay were not writing theology. They were cataloging a world already divided into sacred and mundane, ordered and chaotic, powerful and ordinary. The divisions existed. The Dingir sign simply acknowledged them. Only later, much later, do names appear beside the sign. By the time the great myth cycles are written, Dingir has transformed. It no longer marks categories. It precedes divine personalities. Dingir Enki Dingir Enlil Dingir Inanna. The gods step into the word like tenants moving into a house that was already standing. The structure was there. They arrived to inhabit it. But this raises a question the texts never directly address. If the sign existed before the gods who would bear it, what was it marking in those centuries when no divine names accompanied it? The answer lies not in what the early scribes wrote, but in what they did not write. They never explain the origin of sacredness. They never describe how certain places became Dingir. They inherit a world already divided and record it as they find it. Mountains that matter, stars that guide, boundaries that hold cosmic significance. The classification precedes the classifier. And this pattern, words outlasting their original reference, appears again and again in the oldest Sumerian vocabulary. Another term even older, even more abstract. Ani, heaven, earth, the boundary between above and below. It appears in the earliest texts not as a creation, but as a condition. Separation already achieved, order already imposed. The texts do not say who separated them, only that they are separate. In later myths, gods perform this separation. Enlil drives apart heaven and earth. Divine will creates cosmic structure. But the oldest references to Enki contain no agent. The condition simply exists, and the scribes record it. This is the paradox embedded in the foundation of written history. The Sumerians did not write down beginnings. They wrote down inheritances. Their words describe a world already organized, already sacred, already functioning under principles no one claims to have invented. The Dingir sign marks holiness. Before there were gods to be holy, the Mi circulate as principles before myths assign them owners. The cities stand before the chronicles explain who built them. And beneath all of it, a silence where an origin story should be. Not absence of knowledge, absence of claim. The Sumerians did not write, "We do not know." They wrote as if the question had never occurred to them. As if the world had always been this way. As if divinity was not something that arrived, but something that was already there when they learned to write it down. So the question deepens, if the word for the sacred existed before the gods who would claim it, if holiness was a category before it became a being, then what were the earliest Sumerians actually naming when they pressed that star sign into clay? They were naming the quality itself, not the being who would later claim to possess it. This becomes clear when you examine how the Dingir sign actually functions in the earliest tablets. It does not behave like a word. It behaves like punctuation. A mark that changes how the word beside it should be understood without adding meaning of its own. Linguists call these marks determinatives, silent signs that classify rather than define. In Sumerian cuneiform, determinatives appear throughout the writing system. A wooden object receives the sign for tree. A metal tool receives the sign for copper. A person's name receives the sign for man or woman. The reader does not pronounce the determinative. It exists only to clarify category. And in the earliest records, Dingir functions exactly this way. When pressed before the word for mountain Ding, it does not mean divine mountain or mountain of the gods. It marks the mountain as belonging to the category of powerful sacred things. The mountain itself holds significance. The Dingir sign acknowledges that significance without explaining its source. The same pattern appears in astronomical texts. Stars are marked Dingir not because gods inhabit them, but because they navigate. They predict. They hold authority over time itself. Farmers plant by them. Priests calculate festivals by them. They structure human life. The sign recognizes their power, and then strangely the sign appears beside abstractions that have no physical form at all. Tablets from Uruk's temple quarter list those principles of cosmic order, and press the Dingya sign beside each one. Kingship is Ding. Justice is Ding. Music is Ding. Not personified, not mythologized, simply marked as categories that shape civilization. The sign says this matters in ways beyond the ordinary. But here is where the linguistic record fractures. When Adian scribes, speakers of a Semitic language who would later dominate Mesopotamia, encounter Sumerian texts, they translate Ding with their own word. And Yu does not mean sacred category. It means God, a being, a personality, an agent who acts. The Akkadians inherit a classification system and mistake it for a cast of characters. By the second millennium, being sign no longer marks categories. It introduces gods. Every divine name in Adian receives the Ding determinative, and scribes begin using it as shorthand. The Dingya of this city means the patron deity. The semantic shift is total. What once marked significance now marks divinity. What once indicated category now indicates being. And here is the moment that breaks the narrative cleanly in half. We possess tablets where both usages exist simultaneously. Transitional texts from the early dynastic period show scribes pressing Dingye before both abstract principles and divine names in the same document. On one line, Dingir marks a boundary stone. On the next, it precedes the name Inanna. Same sign, same scribe. Two utterly different functions. The old meaning and the new meaning exist side by side as if the word itself is undergoing transformation in real time. The gods are moving into the word while it still remembers what it meant before they arrived. And yet no text explains this transition. No scribe writes. We now use this sign differently. The change occurs silently across generations until the original meaning is simply forgotten. By the time the great mythological tablets are composed at Nippur, Dingir means only one thing: God. The category has been wholly consumed by its occupants. But the earliest tablets remember they preserve a moment when divinity was not something that acted, but something that was a quality recognized in mountains, stars, boundaries, and principles, long before anyone thought to ask which God made them that way. The word existed. The structure existed. The category existed. The gods arrived later, found the word wing, and stepped inside. So, the question that haunted the previous chapter now sharpens into something more precise. If the Dingir sign marked sacred significance for centuries before divine personalities claimed it, when exactly did the transition occur? And why did no one think to write down that something fundamental had changed? The answer is written in mud, brick, and silence. Beneath the foundations of Eridu's temple to Enki, god of fresh water, wisdom, and cosmic order, archaeologists uncovered something that should not exist according to mythological chronology. 17 earlier shrines stacked one atop another like geological strata, descending through layers of habitation that predate writing itself. Each shrine identical in orientation, each rebuilt in exactly the same location, each containing offering platforms, ritual deposits, and evidence of continuous worship stretching back into the 6th millennium BC, more than 2,000 years before Enki's name appears in any written text. The temples existed, the rituals existed, the sacredness existed, but no god was named. Excavators documented fish bones arranged in deliberate patterns on altar platforms, pottery shards embedded in foundation deposits, burnt grain, libation vessels, the archaeological signature of sustained religious practice across millennia. Yet in those earliest levels, not a single inscription, not one carved dedication, not one divine name pressed into clay. Whatever was being worshipped had no name or required none, and Eridu is not an anomaly. At Uruk, beneath the towering ziggurat complex that would later bear Inanna's name, Excavation reveals platform after platform, built and rebuilt across generations. The famous White Temple, dating to the late 4th millennium BC, sits at top architectural layers, extending back centuries before the goddess appears in written sources. Stone column hall beneath that limestone temple beneath that. Each phase representing decades or centuries of construction. Each requiring coordinated labor, each oriented to the same celestial alignments. The sacred geography was already mapped. The ritual calendar was already functioning. The cosmic order was already being maintained. The gods came later to explain what humans were already doing. This pattern repeats at site after site across southern Mesopotamia. At Nepa, preiterate shrines underlay the later temple of Enlil. At Lagos, unnamed sanctuaries precede the cult of Ningu. At Ur, the earliest occupation layers contain ritual architecture predating the moon god Nana by more than a millennium. But here is the detail that fractures everything: the continuity itself. These are not abandoned sites later reclaimed by new populations with new gods. These are continuously inhabited sacred centers where the same ritual practices persist across the transition from pre-literate to literate culture. The offering deposits do not change. The architectural orientations remain constant. The festival calendar, readable in astronomical alignments and agricultural schedules, continues unbroken. The mythology changes, the names change, the explanations change, the practice does not. Which means the Sumerians inherited functioning religious systems they did not create at sites, they did not found maintaining rituals whose origins they could not explain, and rather than invent new practices, they simply continued what was already there. Generation after generation, pressing the same offering bowls into the same mud brick altars their ancestors built for reasons no one could remember. The sacred preceded the god who would claim it. Archaeologists mapping these temple sequences note something else, quieter but equally strange. Many of the earliest shrines align not with later divine personalities, but with natural features. Eridu's temples face the ancient coastline of the Persian Gulf. Uruk's platforms orient to specific star rises. Nep's sacred precinct centers on a natural spring that predates construction by millennia. The sites were chosen for what they were, not for who would later reside in them. Sacredness flowed from geography, astronomy, hydrology, qualities of place rather than divine decree. The temples marked power that was already present. The rituals maintained order that was already functioning. The architecture formalized relationships between earth, water, sky, and human community that existed before anyone thought to name a god responsible for them. And when writing finally arrives and scribes begin recording the divine, they do not write, "The gods founded these temples." They write, "The temples have always been here." They do not describe origins. They describe continuity. The silence is not absence of information. It is acknowledgement of something deeper, that the sacred was recognized, not created. That divinity was encountered, not invented. That long before the Anunnaki were named as administrators of cosmic order, that order was already being administered by humans who needed no mythology to know which places held power. So the question deepens into territory. The myths themselves refuse to enter. If places were sacred before gods had names, if rituals functioned before myths explained them, then what made them sacred in the first place? The second word is even older and even stranger. In Sumerian texts, the Mi are described as divine powers, objects the gods possess, distribute, and guard. Kingship is a Me. Justice is a Mi. Music, metalwork, writing, priesthood, each is a Me that can be transferred between deities like property-changing hands. The famous myth Inanna and Enki describes the goddess traveling to Eridu and tricking Enki into giving her the Mi while he is drunk. She loads them onto her boat and sails back to Uruk, stealing civilization itself. It is a vivid story. It is also impossible because when archaeologists trace the institutions the Mi represent, they find them operating centuries, sometimes millennia before the myths describing their divine distribution were written. Kingship existed before Enki held it. Law codes were being enforced before Inanna stole them. Music was being played, metal was being worked, temples were being administered by priests long before any text claimed these were divine possessions that could be given or taken away. The MAI were not gifts from the gods. They were descriptions of systems already functioning. And the word itself reveals this. Linguists analyzing early Sumerian note that me does not originally mean divine power or sacred object. It means something closer to essence or proper function, the way a thing is supposed to work. The MI of kingship is the principle that makes kingship function correctly. The MI of metalwork is the knowledge that makes bronze strong and tools sharp. The MI of music is the structure that makes sound meaningful rather than noise. These are not possessions. These are operational principles. And in the oldest references, inscriptions from the early dynastic period, nearly 5,000 years old, the me appear without divine ownership. Texts list them as qualities cities possess, not as powers gods distribute. Uruk has me, or has me. Lagash has me. The cities themselves hold the principles that make civilization work. No myth explains how they acquired them. They simply have them. The way a river has water or a mountain has stone. The gods enter this picture later as administrators of what is already there. But to understand how complete the reversal is, how thoroughly myth inverts the archaeological timeline, you must see what existed before the myths were written. Take Wipe, the first and most important of the me. The Sumerian king list claims kingship descended from heaven after the flood, divine authority granted to human rulers. But seals and administrative tablets from Uruk show kingship functioning as early as 3400 BC. Kings named, tribute recorded, labor organized, while the king list itself was not compiled until around 2100 BC, more than a millennium later. The institution came first. The explanation of its divine origin came after, or take law another me, the myth's place in divine hands. The Code of Namu, one of the oldest law codes, discovered dates to around 2100 BC. But legal proceedings documented in contracts, dispute settlements, and court records appear in tablets from Shuruppak and Farah, dating to 2600 BC and earlier. Legal principles were being applied. Precedents were being established. Justice was being administered for centuries before any king claimed his laws came from the gods. The system was already running. The mythology simply assigned credit. The same pattern appears in craft production. Cylinder seals from the Uruk period 3400 BC show sophisticated understanding of metalworking, gem cutting, and artistic composition. Workshops at Telra contain evidence of mass-reduced pottery using standardized techniques. Administrative tablets record specialized labor. Copperworkers, weavers, seal carvers, brewers. Each profession operating according to inherited knowledge passed between generations. Craftsmanship existed as functioning expertise long before myths described it as a me that Enki held and distributed. And then there is writing itself. According to later mythology, writing is a me, one of the sacred powers the gods control. But the archaeological record shows writing emerging gradually experimentally from accounting practices in temple and palace archives. Early tablets are not literature or hymns. They are receipts. Grain counted, silver weighed, workers paid. Writing does not descend from heaven. It evolves from the need to track surplus, organize labor, and maintain institutions that have grown too complex for memory alone. The MEI of writing was invented by scribes, not given by gods. Yet by the time the great mythological cycles are composed, texts like Enki and the World Order, where the god travels to each city, distributing the MI, the entire sequence has been reversed. What humans built, myths attribute to divine gift. What emerged from necessity? Mythology frames as cosmic design. The systems came first. The stories explaining their origin came later. But here is where the archaeological evidence becomes impossible to ignore. At Uruk, The administrative archive contains thousands of tablets dating between 3400 and 3100 BC. These tablets record functioning bureaucracy, rations distributed, workers organized, temple economies managed, craft specialists employed, kingship, law, writing, specialized labor, every institution later mythologized as a me, already operating in documented detail. Not one of these tablets mentions divine origin. Not one invokes a god granting these capabilities. They function as pure record-keeping, as if the systems they document are simply facts of civilized life, requiring no supernatural explanation. The mythology explaining these systems as divine gifts does not appear in written form until 1,000 years later. 1,000 years. That is the gap between institution and explanation, between function and mythology, between the MI as operating principles and the MI as divine possessions. For a millennium, Sumerian civilization ran on systems it did not mythologize. And when mythology finally arrived, it did not describe origins. It described ownership, which God now controlled what humans had already built. This is not gradual misunderstanding. This is systematic reframing. Every institution receives a divine administrator after the fact. Every functioning system gets a god to oversee it retrospectively. The MI become possessions precisely because the institutions they describe have become so fundamental, so permanent, that they seem superhuman, not in their creation, but in their persistence. And that raises the most unsettling question yet. Why? Why would a civilization that clearly invented these systems, writing, law, kingship, craft knowledge, then compose elaborate myths attributing their invention to gods? Why frame human achievement as divine gift? Why insist that order descended from heaven when the tablets themselves document humans constructing it from the ground up? The myths of Inanna stealing the MI of Enki, distributing them of divine councils assigning cosmic roles. These are not primitive attempts to explain the world. They are sophisticated narratives composed by literate scribes in functioning bureaucracies who had access to centuries of administrative records documenting exactly how their civilization was built. They knew kingship did not descend from heaven. The tablets proving its human origin were in their own archives. They knew law codes were written by kings, not received from gods. The monuments proclaiming royal authorship stood in their own city centers. They knew writing emerged from accounting, not divine revelation. The evolution from pictograph to cuneiform was visible in their own temple libraries. And yet they wrote the myths anyway. They composed stories attributing to the gods what their own records proved. Humans had done, not from ignorance, from something else. Perhaps the question is not what the MI were before the gods claimed them. Perhaps the question is why civilizations need to forget that they built themselves. Because the archaeological record is clear, the institutions came first. The divine explanations came later. The Amii existed as functioning systems before they became mythological objects. Order preceded authority. Human invention preceded divine credit. So why would scribes who knew this, who could read the evidence in their own archives, choose to tell the story backward? Because between the institutions and the myths explaining them, something drowned. In 1929, archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating the royal cemetery at Ur, when his workers struck a layer of clean water deposited clay more than 8 ft thick. Above it, artifacts from the early dynastic period. Below it, pottery from the Ubaid culture separated by centuries. Between them, sterile alluvial sediment stretching across the entire excavation trench with no trace of human habitation. Woolley famously declared he had found evidence of the biblical flood. He had not. He had found something stranger. Evidence that southern Mesopotamia had drowned repeatedly, and that each time civilization resumed without remembering what had been lost. The flood layer at Ur is not unique. At Shuruppak, the city the Sumerian king list names as the last before the flood, excavators uncovered a similar deposit. 3 ft of water-laid clay dividing earlier occupation from later rebuilding. At Kish, another layer. At Uruk, geological cores reveal multiple inundation episodes. At Lagash, Nippur, and Gayaru, the same pattern. Sterile sediment marking moments when the rivers rose, the canals overflowed, and entire regions went underwater for seasons or years at a time. These were not single catastrophic events. They were recurring disasters, regional in scope, devastating in impact, separated by generations or centuries. And each time they occurred, they did what floods do best. They erased. Mud brick archives dissolved. Clay tablets still drying in cribable workshops turned back to formless clay. Temple records submerged and scattered. Wooden roof beams rotted. Reed structures collapsed. Everything not baked hard in fire or carved into stone simply vanished, leaving behind only what could survive immersion. Foundation stones, kiln-fired pottery, and the faint outlines of walls buried beneath new construction. But here is what makes the Mesopotamian floods so devastating to continuity. They did not destroy the cities themselves. They destroyed the records explaining why the cities existed. Population survived. They rebuilt. They returned to the same sites, cleared the silt, raised new platforms, reconstructed temples on the old foundations. Archaeological sequences show no population replacement, no cultural rupture, no invasion or conquest. The people who rebuilt were the same people or their immediate descendants who had lived there before, but the knowledge did not survive intact. What remained were functioning systems without documentation. Cities that still operated, but whose founding no one could clearly describe. Temples rebuilt on sacred ground, but whose original dedications had washed away. Irrigation networks still channeling water according to ancient surveys whose tablets no longer existed. Institutions that still functioned, but whose origins had become oral memory subject to distortion, simplification, and eventually mythologization. And this is where writing enters the story, not as a beginning, but as a response to loss. The oldest substantial archives in Mesopotamia date to the period immediately following evidence of major flooding, 3400 to 3200 BC at Uruk, 2600 BC at Shuruppak, 2500 BC at Far. Writing does not emerge in a stable continuous civilization confidently recording its origins. It emerges in cities rebuilding after disruption, scrambling to document what they can still remember before the next flood washes it away. Early tablets are frantic with record-keeping, who owns which field, who received how much grain, which temple holds claim to which labor. These are not leisurely chronicles. These are archives rebuilt after catastrophe by scribes trying to reconstruct administrative continuity from fragmented memory and surviving practice. And here is the detail that changes everything. The writing system itself shows signs of hasty standardization. Cuneiform does not evolve gradually from simple to complex. It appears in the archaeological record already systematic. Hundreds of signs, grammatical markers, numerical notation, all functioning as an integrated system within a few generations of its first appearance. Linguists studying this rapid emergence note that it resembles not organic evolution, but deliberate reconstruction, as if scribes were formalizing practices that had existed in perishable media. Wooden tablets, reed tallies, leather records that no longer survived. Writing may not have been invented after the floods. It may have been reinvented, recreated from memory of systems that had washed away. Which means the oldest tablets we possess may not represent the beginning of literacy. They may represent civilization's second attempt to write things down after the first attempt dissolved in floodwater. And if that is true, then every assumption about Sumerian origins inverts. The myths do not describe distant prehistory. They describe recent trauma, events that happened within living memory, or one generation removed, catastrophic enough to fracture continuity, but recent enough that survivors still remembered fragments of what had been lost. The flood myths are not ancient legends. They are disaster reports. Consider what the Sumerian king list actually says. After the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish, not established, not founded, lowered as if it had been somewhere else, and was being restored. And that single word reveals the entire structure of post-flood memory. Institutions are not described as human creations, but as restorations of something that existed before something that had to be brought back after disruption. This is not mythology. This is survivor narrative. The gods distribute are not divine inventions. They are recovered principles, systems that had functioned, been lost, and now needed explanation because the records describing their origins no longer existed. Kingship, law, craft knowledge, temple ritual, all recovered from practice and oral memory, then retroactively attributed to divine gift because no written documentation survived to prove human authorship. The gods do not create civilization in these myths. They restore it. And restoration requires something to restore. Something that existed before, was lost, and now must be explained without the records that would prove where it came from. But floods do not just destroy archives. They destroy chronology. When continuity fractures, time collapses. Events that were separated by centuries in the actual sequence blur together in memory. Institutions that developed gradually appear to arrive fully formed. Complex evolution gets simplified into single moments of origin. And without written records to anchor events in sequence, survivors compress multiple generations of development into mythic instantiation. The gods gave us this all at once after the waters receded. Geological evidence supports this compression of time. Core samples from the Mesopotamian Delta show multiple major inundation events between 4000 and 2800 BC, a period of more than a millennium during which floods struck repeatedly. Each event would have disrupted record-keeping. Each would have required rebuilding archives from scratch. Each would have pushed origins further back beyond the reach of reliable memory. By the time writing stabilizes and substantial mythological texts are composed, the actual origins of Sumerian institutions lie behind multiple episodes of archival destruction. The scribes writing in 2500 BC are attempting to explain systems that emerged in 3500 BC separated from them by 1,000 years and at least 3 major regional floods that destroyed most written documentation. They have functioning cities. They have working institutions. They have inherited vocabulary whose original meanings are already unclear. They have sacred sites whose founders are unknown. And they have no archives explaining how any of it began. So they do what any civilization does when memory fails. They construct explanatory narratives from fragments. They attribute to divine action what they can no longer trace to human agency. They turn institutional continuity into mythological descent. They transform the operational principles preserved in practice, but not in writing, into divine possessions that must be distributed because no one can remember who made them in the first place. The myths are not lies. They are reconstructions. The best explanations survivors could create for systems they inherited, but whose origins the floods had taken. And this transforms the question entirely. We have been asking, why would scribes attribute human inventions to gods when their own archives proved human authorship? But now the answer becomes clear. They had no archives proving human authorship. The archives had drowned. What survived were the institutions themselves: cities, temples, laws, irrigation systems, still functioning, still requiring administration, but now separated from their origins by sterile layers of flood-deposited clay. The gods are not fictional. They are mnemonic narrative structures created to preserve institutional memory when documentary memory has been destroyed. Divine figures carry knowledge across the gap the floods created, holding together the fractured timeline between what was built and when it could finally be written down. So the question is no longer why the myths exist. The question is what happens to meaning when memory is wiped clean but systems survive. Memory requires a container when records fail. Cognitive anthropologists studying oral cultures after literacy collapse document a consistent pattern. Abstract principles transform into personified agents. Justice becomes a judge. Wisdom becomes a sage. Order becomes a king. The human mind cannot easily preserve complex institutional knowledge across generations without narrative structure. Stories survive where concepts fade. This is what happened to Dingir. In pre-flood texts, the fragments that survived. Ding marks quality. Post-flood. It precedes names. The word stops describing and starts identifying. The category becomes inhabited. Sacred mountains become dwelling places of gods. Sacred principles become divine possessions. The me stop being operational knowledge and become objects Enki guards in his temple at Eridu. But here is what the textual evolution reveals. The earliest god names are transparent descriptions, not proper nouns. Ani, heaven, earth. Enlil, Lord Wind. Enki, Lord Earth. These are not mysterious divine appellations. They are literal labels for cosmic functions. The gods are named after what they do, as if they were created to carry meanings that had lost their previous containers. Personification is not primitive confusion. It is sophisticated preservation, transforming institutional memory into narrative that can survive without archives, can be transmitted orally, can hold complex relationships in story form when documentary form has dissolved. The myths are not inventions. They are encryptions of knowledge the floods nearly destroyed. So when memory fails, is myth invention or preservation by other means. And then finally the Anunnaki appear not in creation myths, but in ration lists. Administrative tablets from Lagash and Gersu dating to the early dynastic period record offerings distributed to the Anunnaki. Bread, beer, grain measured and delivered to divine officials. They are listed alongside human administrators receiving payment for services rendered. The Dingia sign precedes their names, marking them as sacred officials, not creators. The Anunnaki do not establish cosmic order in these earliest references. They manage it, divine bureaucrats overseeing what is already functioning. Their hierarchy mirrors temple administration, councils, assignments, jurisdictions. They govern a world already built. No myths describe them founding cities. No hymns praise them for creating humanity. They simply appear in the records as managers of systems that were already there when writing began. If the Anunnaki managed rather than created the world, who built what they governed? Every Sumerian text begins the same way. After kingship descended, after the flood, after the Mi were distributed, never when kingship was created, or how the flood came, or who made the me. The texts assume origins lie elsewhere beyond reach in a time writing cannot access. No Sumerian myth describes the invention of civilization. They describe its administration. Kings do not found dynasties. They continue them. Temples are not built. They are restored. Even the gods do not create the world. They organize what is already present. The entire corpus of Sumerian literature is written in the passive voice of inheritance. Authority is received, not seized. Order is maintained, not established. Everything begins with something already there. If civilization was inherited, not created, what does that say about the forgotten world before it? Words outlast the worlds that speak them. Dingir survived when the gods who bore it were forgotten. The me endured when the institutions they named collapsed. These words are fossils, preserved shapes of meanings that once lived, now hardened into script, carrying knowledge their speakers could no longer fully recall. The Sumerians were not founders. They were inheritors, scribes of a civilization already ancient when they learned to write it down. Their myths do not celebrate creation. They mourn loss, stories composed to hold together what the floods had fractured, to preserve in narrative what could no longer be proven in record. Writing was not triumph, it was elegy. Civilization did not begin with gods. Gods began when meaning outlived memory. Words remember what myths forget. And so, beneath the names of gods, beneath the myths pressed into clay, the oldest Sumerian records leave us not a beginning, but a word still waiting to be understood.